Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jessica Pierce, and I work for the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. I'll be your host for today's webinar. And before we begin, I want to provide you with a brief overview of how our webinar system works and how you can interact with the presenters. I should mention that the points of view that are expressed today are those of the presenters and do not represent any official position or policy of our funders. This presentation is a joint presentation between the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges and NAICJA, who will be welcoming you in a moment. All right, so during the presentation, everyone's phones will be muted. We ask that if you have any questions or comments during the presentation, you use either the chat box or that you raise your hand to be unmuted. To raise your hand, look for the icon of the person with their hand raised toward the top of your screen. It's usually kind of in a little bar right above the PowerPoint. Once you raise your hand, I can unmute your phone and you can comment or share your own information. If you're joining with a group, if you could note that in chat so we can keep an accurate count of the number of folks that are on the webinar today, that would be great. And I want to make sure that you have all of the information you need. So if you have any questions, please do feel free to send me a chat. You can do either a group chat or a private chat. If you'd like to send me a private chat, please just put your mouse over my name in the list and select send private chat. Getting some feedback on the line. All right, I will turn it over to Ansley Sherman from NAICJA to welcome everyone as well.
Thank you, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on sober support in tribal communities. My name is Ansley Sherman. I'm Muscogee Creek, and I am program attorney for the National American Indian Court Judges Association. I'll be moderating today. We want this to be an interactive experience, so please feel free to ask questions throughout and to make use of the chat feature. And with that, I'll hand it back over to you, Jessica.
Thanks. So we selected the topic of sober support based on surveys that the CTOS grantees had completed. Many of you are CTOS grantees. And sober support was one of the issues where folks were wanting more information. And what we wanted to do with today's webinar is talk about sober support and talk about sober support beyond just what you might think of as traditional sober support, which would be those kind of 12-step programs that we all know about. Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, and specifically in Native American communities, the Red Road. So we want to talk about why sober support is important, what it really looks like, and we want to talk about why it's important for the court to think about sober support, not just in healing to wellness courts, but for clients across the board that come into court who might be there for at least partly drug-related reasons. Our faculty today are Trina Hart, a treatment provider who will be kind of giving us the treatment point of view, and Judge Kim McGinnis, who will talk a little bit about things from the court side and then also share kind of the unique things that they have done in Pojoaque to address some sober issues for specifically opioid users. So I'm going to turn it over to Trina Hart, and Trina, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself and tell us more about your background, and then get started. Trina. Oh, we're getting some weird feedback there on the line. Can you use just your phone and not your microphone on your computer, so if you can mute your computer speaker?
Can you hear me better?
Yes, I can.
Okay. It's been kind of weird, so I'm hoping to not get cut off. My name's Trina Hart. I have a master's in counseling, and I work in primary Pinal County, Arizona, which is between Gila River Indian Community and the Teal Reservation. And I've lived in the area that's semi-rural for Native communities. And I've been a social worker my whole life, my whole career. I've been working for the last, I work for a private agency, and we were doing Pinal County juvenile drug court for a lot of years before funding got cut. And in that position, we've had several clients that came through from Native families either Gila River or Teal or other reservations that just happen to migrate to that little area. And that's kind of my background. Once we lost the funding for juvenile drug court, we started doing a group of just probation itself on sober supports, on keeping kids clean, and an array of topics. So that's kind of my background. That's where I'm from. So we're going to go ahead and start going through the slides at this point. Sorry, guys. My phone is everything's been kind of weird. I keep getting in and out, so I'm going to try to follow through with this.
We can hear you really well right now, so hopefully it stays
okay.
that way.
I can't hear myself. This sounds really funny on my end, so I'm going to keep going. And I seem to lose topic. Somebody please get me back on track.
Okay.
So we talked about sober supports and what sober supports are. When Jessica approached me about this, I had a really hard time finding a very clear definition of what exactly sober supports meant. And I reached out to colleagues at universities that did research on substance use, and I reached out to friends that work in the field for 20 plus years, and everybody kind of had a different definition. But one thing they all had in common was that it is basically the system that the client creates that's made up of very specific people, therapists that they trust, groups, organizations, churches, whatever was in their neighborhood and whatever was obtainable in their neighborhood. And that's when some of the debate came in, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. I'm trying to change the PowerPoint, but I'm having problems on my end.
I can do it.
Okay, thank you. So one of the things we talked about in doing this research is why sober support was important for your community. What is ultimately the goal of having sober support for your clients? And the ultimate goal is basically we want people to be sober. We want them to get on with their lives, be productive citizens. So how do you get that? So basically we're looking at, client. It's important because you want the client to engage in whatever services you order. So as a judge, if you order, you have to be sober for 90, the rest of probation. You're on probation for a year, you got to be sober. Ultimately reduces crime. It keeps families together. And then you rely on what natural resources are out there for the community and for the client. Ultimately, for the families, it creates a sense of belonging. You want them to be able to utilize their natural supports to be able to get along. And then you have a lower chance of relapse, a higher chance of success. And then it gets them back into the community re-engagement where they are productive members of society. That's ultimately the goal of sober supports. That's what we want for our families. Can we go to the next slide? So then the question becomes, why is it important for the courts to care about the sober support resources that are out there? And how do you find those sober support resources that are out there? So the importance are what we put in the slide: the lower relapse, community engagement, client engagement, identifying natural support. But the ultimate reason the courts want to care about it because they want to see the client be successful. They want them to be able to have a productive life. They want them to be able to use their natural resources, to utilize peers, friends, family, cousins, uncles, teachers maybe that they've had, mentors. And of course, everybody wants increased statistics so we can continue to get funding. That's, kind of the bottom line. So the question is, what types of service supports are available for your clients? And this is, so that's kind of a question we're going to put out there. Right now, as communities, what have you guys identified as sober supports in your community.
So if you could write in chat or raise your hand and I can unmute your phone, what have you identified as sober supports within your community?
I like that. I like the sweat lodge teachings. I think that's really important for our communities.
Nathaniel, I see you raised your hand, but I don't know your phone number. Your phone isn't attached. If you could give me the first 3 digits of your phone number, I can unmute your phone. You can just type that into chat. Gilda, your mother's, daughters, fathers, and sons traditional group meeting sounds interesting. Can you type a little bit more of a description about that?
That's a really good question. I was going to ask that same thing. I definitely would like to learn a little bit more about them.
Yeah, it's not one that I've heard of.
And the sobriety, the AA meetings, NA meetings, having meetings that are accessible to clients is extremely important. Language crafts, I like that too.
That sounds fun.
So it sounds like there's some traditional types of support out there.
And
how do
Rita,
people? What about family and friends? How do people utilize family and friends as support? Or even community resources? Because there's community resources out there that I think a lot of people just are not aware of.
And if you guys have any links for descriptions of any of these cool programs you're writing, Rita, it looks like you have one about the medicine wheel. If you have a link to a website that everybody else could go to, you can put that in chat too. That way we'll all be able to access those resources. Thanks.
I agree with the judging who says that families and friends can cut both ways. And that's why when you do look at utilizing your natural support, such as family and friends, how do you pick which ones are actually going to be supportive? You know, do you pick your Uncle David, who's been sober for 10 years, who is willing to help you? However, you have to be ready for that help, and you have to be willing to hear what Uncle David has to say. And sometimes I think when we're first ordering and working with our clients, they're not in that position yet. So to be able to utilize family and friends, we do have to be very careful, because we can't expect our client Joe to go and talk to Uncle David when he hasn't talked to Uncle David for 10 years. And there's bridges that have to be rebuilt, and there's healing that has to happen. And I like that, educating family members about resources. I agree, that is very important, especially if those family members are going to be the natural supports. The goal is to find 3 or 4, 5, 6 natural supports that the client could use, along with the community resources, the paid therapists, the people that are involved in his treatment team or her treatment team.
I think Sabrina makes a great point too, that Al-Anon can be really helpful for helping create that sober support group by helping our families understand what's going on.
So then my question then becomes, how do you, well, I do want to talk one thing before we move on. I do want to talk a little bit about the types of sober support that are available. We talked about community supports, natural resources, family, friends, religious entities, churches, community groups. And I want to talk a little bit about social media, how social media has made such an impact in our world and in everybody's lives. How do we utilize social media as a natural support? What are some of the things that you guys have did where you had to really bring in social media to use as a support group? I'm going to give you an example. I had a client who, she was 17 years old, about to turn 18. She was court-ordered into the drug court program. She was going to transition from juvenile drug court into the adult drug court. And it was a very technical process. There was a legal process. There was a bunch of questions, but she wasn't ready to leave treatment, and she still needed help. So adult drug court decided to take her without her having charges, and she was going to do it in a voluntary type basis. It was very experimental, and what she ended up doing was using social media, and she found some sober support groups on social media. We went over ways that she could be safe. We went over what she needed to do if she felt she was being pulled into a relationship. We found and I'm glad that Ms. Curry said that, because we found the virtual meetings, and that was a big eye-opener for us as a treatment team. And this was a few years ago. This had to be about 5 years ago. So we were able to also develop support groups with social media. She was involved in sex trafficking. She was involved in domestic violence abuse. And we found a lot of support groups where she really didn't have to go. Transportation was an issue. Her location was an issue. She was very rural. She didn't have transportation. There were no bus systems. She had PTSD when she went around large crowds. So this was a real good natural tool for her, and we were able to utilize it as something that could help her because of where she was located, but also to teach her ways to be safe and to not get pulled into another relationship or not get pulled into something maybe she didn't want to do. So it was very interesting. It was very educational and informative for us as a team, but also it was something that worked in today's day and age. So Sober Indians on Facebook, I have to look that up. I haven't seen that one. Does anybody else have any other online support that they found that worked for their clients?
I think, Trina, one of the things that seems really obvious, especially hearing your story, is that sober support is a really individualized thing, right? That people have to kind of figure out what works for them. And so having as many options available as possible seems like a really good thing to do.
Yes, it is. It is very individualized. And I think as we look at what type of available for our clients, we have to also remember that they are individuals, and rather than blanket court order the same thing for every client, we have to figure out what does work individually. I mean, there's certain requirements, I understand that have to be met. But when you look at the bigger picture and how this is going to help the client be successful, it's very important to look at what they're capable of doing and where they're capable of going.
Well, and with the client that you spoke of, she had some real specific challenges, not just that she was rural, but around things like PTSD with large crowds. So not only is it individualized for her location, but also with the particular challenges that she had. So I mean, I just think that it's so multidimensional you got to get creative sometimes.
Yes, you do. You have to always be creative. You have to always be one step of the client, and there's times when you run out of steps, and then always asking the client what will work for you. Some things work better. Some clients have been through AA groups and NA groups every day for 3 years straight, and that worked really well for them. Some have tried it, and it didn't work. So then what do we need to do to still create their sober community? How do we get sober support, especially for those clients that live in very rural areas where they don't have transportation, and they live in a village where there's 10 houses and they're all relatives, and they don't have transportation, they don't have phone service, they don't have internet, social media service. I like Stan Nix's comment about youth that will text you, and you can have a whole conversation with them about texting, but they will not answer your calls. In the last 20 years, being a therapist, that has been my experience.
Yeah, I think that's all youth now, right? Nobody answers their phones.
Yes, I know adults that do that as well. So then the question becomes, how do we find additional resources in your community? Who is assigned to finding these resources? Is it the case manager, the therapist?
We actually have a poll about that very thing.
This is a very interesting question to me. It's interesting watching the numbers change.
Right, I'll close the poll. So it looked like about a third of folks didn't have a list at all.
And that's concerning. And I've known that in my career, I've worked in agencies, and I myself have not had an idea going to a new community, maybe not really knowing what was in the community. It is very important for my answer to that question would have been, it is everybody's responsibility to know what your community serves. If you're the judge and you're court ordering services, you want to be aware if that community has the services that you're ordering, otherwise your client will not be successful if they don't. As a treatment provider, you want to be aware of what services you're referring your clients to or giving them additional help or finding natural supports for them, because you ultimately don't want a client in treatment forever. And if you don't know that AA at the church has been gone for 2 years and you say, hey, call this number, they'll help you, and you say call and it's not there, they're not going to believe what you're saying. So it's very important for everybody on that team to know what resources are there. And it's, in my opinion, everybody's responsibility to know what resources are out there. I'm liking Stan Nix over here. Not sure who you are, but I'm liking your answers. So how do you find your resources? I listed some places that are just kind of common, but there's also a lot of uncommon places, and I like to ask everybody to kind of list some uncommon places, because community centers, advocacy centers, alliance centers, libraries, tribal leaders sometimes will hear of resources. substance programs. Colleges have resources. Churches have resources. You can find, in today's day and age, a lot of younger people will use the internet. You could find resources.
Lots of great resources in the chat today. I want to make sure everybody knows that this webinar is being recorded. We will post the recorded webinar and the transcript of the chat, so you'll be able to access all of these post-webinar as well.
Sorry, guys. I think I was disconnected, so I'm back.
Were you saying anything really interesting while you were disconnected?
I always think I am, but I might not have been. I do like the idea of it's everybody's responsibility. And we should have put that on the poll. I really like that because I do agree that it is everybody's responsibility. But I was talking about trust and the clients being able to trust you. And so I think it's important to know the resources. If we're saying, hey, as a client, you have to go do this and you need to do it by a certain date, we have to know that that agency or that place will see the client within that certain time frame. Because a lot of times I think we expect clients to do things where in reality they can't get it done in 10 days or in 2 days. And it takes a while to get things done. So it's important to know the resources that are out there, how they work, what their expectations are, and to have a contact person because resources do change. You get additional resources added, you get resources that are taken away.
That's probably a good time for our how often do you update your resource list poll question.
Yes.
Lots of folks just updating when things change, which makes sense. It's always tricky, though, because how do you know if something has changed?
It almost looks like it's a policy change. So when things change, I'm going to update something to change with the policy. And I don't know if that's very, very beneficial to the client. But I know that's how a lot of things in life work.
Yeah, and Rita's point is great that oftentimes it's things like a grant that drives whether or not this happens. And I think that, again, that's life, right?
So I do think updating the policy or updating the changes, to really look at identifying, when we need to do this and to make it, a shared responsibility and maybe something if you have drug court, you guys meet weekly, if you have, or if you have monthly staffing, to really update and make that part of your regular agenda that you do bring updated resources. Somebody, everybody checks on a few resources. So then you're always having updated information and everybody's responsible for doing a different role in that updating. So we'll talk a little bit about what AA is. And there's still a lot of people, when they come into the program, everybody's kind of heard of AA, but some people really don't know what AA provides. I have a really good friend of mine who has a brother, and her brother has been in AA for, I want to say, 40-something years. He still goes every week to his meetings, and even when he goes on vacation, he finds a part of his vacation routine, I can't say that fast, is to find an AA meeting that he could go to while he's on vacation. Even if it's out of the country, he finds meetings. So his meetings worldwide. And one thing about Alcoholics Anonymous that I really like is that it is an open door. And there are some closed meetings, but most of the meetings are open. That means any person could find a meeting, and if they're having that meeting, they could go. And I did find out as I was doing this, there is an Alcoholics Anonymous website. I don't know what it is offhand, but I think they really tried to keep up with where meetings are and whether or not meetings are open or closed. And I didn't know that they had I figured they had a website, but I never looked at it and I never thought to look at it. But I was pleasantly surprised that they did have a list of meetings in the area, places to go, numbers to call, so you could see, okay, is there really a meeting there still? Is this old information? Yes.
And it looks like Joseph posted that link for us. And Sabrina.
Yes, thank you guys, and that's what I found. And there's just a lot of information on the site in general, so it is a really good resource to use and to have and to give to your clients to use as well. I think a lot of people have cell phones. Sometimes people don't have cell phones that they use, but they have cell phones that they use just for internet purposes. To be able to have that resource and to be able to do the virtual meetings is something I think that treatment providers really need to think about and to see how that would work. Is that okay to do a virtual meeting if you can't get to a meeting? Silkworth.net. What is that website? I'm not familiar with that.
Joseph, if you could provide us a little description, that would be great. Trina, I put up the slide for NA. Now, it's my understanding that NA meetings are harder to come by than AA meetings. Is that true?
It depends on the area you live in. I think rural areas, it's been my experience with rural areas that they're harder to find, and they're especially harder to find for juveniles. You could find them for adults, but they're also more fluid, where somebody might start an NA meeting and then all of a sudden it's not there anymore. So NA meetings, I found in my experience in the last 20 years that, they come and go, you will find some that have been stable, and the people there, I have juveniles that go to NA meetings. Most of them are adult-oriented, and so they go there and they see some old person with long white hair, and this is the story that they bring back. And they talk about, well, I don't want to be that person. I don't want to be 60 years old talking in front of other people about my drug use. So I've had feedback from juveniles, and it's really interesting how it's the same feedback, and they feel the same way. We have found NA meetings for juveniles, and like I said, they're very fluid. Sometimes they're there, and sometimes they're not. So if you find one and it's been current, then I suggest you use that as a really strong resource. Or if it's been stable, I mean. And the YPAAF, we have utilized that in the area that I worked in. So finding meetings finding where they're at, making sure that they're either adult or juvenile-oriented, depending on what you're looking at. I tend to send, as a treatment provider, I tend to send my 17-year-old to the adult groups because legally they're going to be an adult within that year, and I want them to have that experience. They use a 12-step model, and I think that a lot of the meetings you could find, a lot of churches in my area have the meetings that are really community-based, and like both NA and AA. So finding them and finding really stable meetings that have been there is very important. And to have that on your resource list is something that I think that all treatment teams need to have.
And Tamara has a great point here that for kids when we send them to meetings, but even I think and for women and young women, we want to be sure about safety in meetings. And so when we think about court staff and their responsibilities, I don't think court has to go and vet all meetings, but I do think you have to be really thoughtful about making sure that the clients are going to be safe where they're going. And so having kind of a general understanding, and if there's women-only meetings or if there are young people-only meetings, those are going to be a better way to direct people who come to court, right? Don't you think, Trina?
Yes, I think it's really important. It's important to talk to them about safety just in general when it comes to going to any meetings, getting involved with groups. Even if it's a court-ordered group that probation runs maybe, you still talk about safety. It's really easy for kids to get pulled into, younger people to get pulled into situations. I've heard a lot of opinions about either NAICJA, just different sober groups that are out there. I have heard of a few Christian-based sober groups that do the 12-step program. So safety is really something that I think as a treatment provider, it needs to be addressed before you send a juvenile to any group, even if it's a juvenile ran group. Because it is easy. Kids are, they're already vulnerable, so they're really easily influenced. That's why I only send my 17-year-olds to adult groups. Usually I have a parent that goes with them. I rarely have kids that go by themselves, but I do have kids that do go by themselves. It depends on the maturity level, what they're able to take in, and how they respond, and how compliant they are. So you do want to take all that into account. If you have a child maybe who's in the spectrum, who's 17, going to be 18, and you want to send them, or even an adult who's in the spectrum who maybe is 18, who maybe has the maturity level of somebody that's 14 or 15, then you really have to look at that individual's capabilities. What are they going to get from the group? How are they going to interact?
Then the last thing we wanted to talk about was the Red Road.
So the Red Road is a peer support group for Native Americans, and you see a lot of research done on the Red Road to recovery, the Red Road to sobriety. I asked a couple of people about, the sober supports and the Red Road, and I was told very recently, within the last month, that NIH is now starting to do research on sober supports and sober recovery. It's a very new concept. So those of you that are research-oriented, you may want to jump on this. But it is a new concept. It's a new term, and I think that information is getting out there about how important it is, especially for Native American communities and semi-rural communities where they have Native Americans living in them, for judges and treatment providers and treatment teams to understand how peer support for Native Americans may be different than another culture, especially if people are going back and forth between rural communities and their reservation. They're going back and forth between home and into a semi-rural or rural area. Terry asked the question, if I have any experience setting up a sober hangout. like a friendship club where teens or adults can hang out. That sounds like a really neat concept. I have not did that. What I have did with my groups, because my groups are in a semi-rural area, and the groups that I ran through Pinal County Juvenile Drug Court were mixed groups, is we created a place with probation that the group kids could go and be sober, no drugs, because everybody was court-ordered to group, where they could hang out on a Saturday, and they're allowed to go to the movies together. They're allowed to go eat. But then they had to drug test on a Monday or Sunday to show that they weren't using during that time. Otherwise, probation will pull them from that. So, but I do like the concept of having a sober support type hangout. I really like that. It was a lot just to get the courts and the probation officers and the families to trust other kids who are in the group, because usually when kids got together, they're in group for a reason. They're in juvenile drug court for a reason. So to trust them to hang out, and then they ended up being their own sober supports. And so they're like, why can't we hang out? We're doing this together. We're trying to be sober together. All of our other friends use, my whole family uses, but you won't let me because it's a probation violation to hang out with one person I know that doesn't use drugs or drink. And I think for Native American families, that's extremely important.
Terry, it sounds like you're going to build something, so maybe in a year or so we can highlight it on another webinar. Keep us posted.
Yes, I like that idea. Yeah, I definitely want to follow up with Terry and see how this project comes along. Very interested in that. And I think that's a concept that some community resources try to have. They try to have like the Boys and Girls, but they try to have different community functions or different buildings where kids could go, but nothing that focuses strictly on this is a sober hangout. No drugs, no alcohol. And maybe do groups. I mean, I really like this idea, and I know that, like I said, Boys and Girls Clubs, they try to create these environments. But you have kids that have drugs on them, they have it in their pockets, that they're not. They bring stuff into places.
Yeah, those are definitely things you have to consider as you're developing a program like that, for sure.
Yeah.
Right, so we're going to pivot from the general to something really specific. So Judge Kim McGinnis in Pojoaque, their court has funding to do some sober living. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Judge McGinnis.
Thanks. Thanks, Trina, for that introduction or the background for sober support. So I've been the judge at the Pueblo, Pojoaque, which is in north central New Mexico, just north of Santa Fe, for about 5 years. And I come from a science background. I have a PhD in neuropharmacology, and then I went into law school after that. So I'm very focused on things that are evidence-based or trying to figure out what's going to work and looking at processes and trying to figure out, the best methods and what's been shown to work, and also trying to do new things that might work even if we don't know for sure if they're going to work. So we do a lot of kind of experimentation, and as Trina said, everybody's different, so each person has to be approached from where they're at and start from where they're at and figure out what's going to work and change things up if it's not whatever we're doing at the time isn't working. And so like many communities in the United States, especially in Indian country, I became the judge here in 2013, and that's when the opioid epidemic was really taking off, and it had been around northern New Mexico for a long time. We were losing people. We're losing people to opioids, losing people to alcohol. And so like many of us, I was running around with basically my hair on fire trying to figure out what is going to work and what might help the community to basically save lives. And one of the things was Healing to Wellness Court. So we got funding starting in 2014 to do a Healing to Wellness Court, and we started that. And with our experience of getting people into that program, and most of the people are either have severe alcohol problems or severe opioid addiction. Those are the basic populations that we work with here in northern New Mexico, and I know a lot of you are dealing also with meth as a huge problem, but we mostly see opioids and alcohol. And so we sort of, step back and tried to figure out what it is that's keeping folks from being successful. And, these are the common barriers, and this is what the literature shows as the common barriers to prevent recidivism or to contribute to recidivism. And the lack of housing, lack of education, lack of job training and employment, lack of substance abuse treatment, and lack of family support. And, obviously these are all, you all know this. And, we get people in our wellness court and we can do case management with them, and we can get them into GED programs, we can get them into substance abuse treatment, we can get them into mental health treatment, we do all those assessments. But if they have to go home to a house where folks are using alcohol or they don't have support for their sobriety, then all of the hard work that all of us are doing isn't going to be helpful to them, because if you're an addict and you're going home to where people are not supportive of your sobriety or are also actively using, it's not going to succeed. So initially we tried to get people into kind of the more commercial sober housing that is available in Santa Fe, which is about 20 miles away, or north of us in another town that's about 10 or 15 miles away. But people don't want to leave the community. If they don't need residential treatment, or if they're coming out of residential treatment, they want to be in their community because they want to be around their family. And so, I decided to apply to CTAS for sober support for, it was kind of I pitched it to the CTAS, which I know you all know is the Coordinated Tribal Assistance Solicitation that comes out every year. So we applied through Purpose Area number 3, which is the supports the courts and sober support issues. And I pitched it as a reentry, part of a reentry program. And what we did was to ask for 2 apartments. Now, Pojoaque has an apartment complex that the tribe owns and runs. And so, which is like a 5-minute walk from the courthouse, which is extremely helpful. So I asked for funding rent for 2 apartments, one for men, one for women. They're each 2-bedroom apartments. So we said max up, 2 people in each room. And I really looked at this as a 3-year pilot program to kind of see what we could learn from this, and we're a year and a half into it now. It started in April of 2017. And we really wanted to get people close in where we could monitor them. They have to sign a contract before folks get in to basically sign away any right to privacy, because we want to be able to go in there and see what's going on. And we actually have been working with BIA, which has a drug-sniffing dog that we put in there about once a month to go through the apartments and just make sure there isn't anything being hidden anywhere that we can't find it. So we give a lot of autonomy to the occupants to set basic rules of, basically, obviously they have the rule of no using, no overnight guests. Unfortunately, in this program, we couldn't allow children just because that was too much for us to deal with at this onset stage. But other than that, we don't have a tour chart that we impose on them. They create their own rules. If they have conflicts, then our substance abuse counselor will sit down with them and kind of try to mediate the issues of roommate issues. So we have, kind of typical roommate issues. And then our goal is that folks are in the program for 6 months, rent-free, and during that time they're getting stable, they're getting sober, their brain is healing, and this really gives them space for their brain to heal. for them to get, several months of sobriety under their belts to so they can start looking for their own job or be able to be strong enough in their sobriety that if they go back to live with their family, they'll be settled in their sobriety and have the resources to be able to stay at their family home. And Pojoaque is very. My philosophy is to be low barrier. I'm low barrier around people coming into the wellness court, and when I say low barrier, it means if you're eligible, and for our wellness court, it's a high risk, high needs, so they're assessed, but we don't do any evaluation of whether somebody may or may not make it through the program. We never say, oh, I don't think he's going to succeed in the program or she's not going to succeed, and that's not an eligibility requirement because we don't know who's going to succeed. So so what I tell people going into the sober living apartment, is that I don't want them to use in the apartment. I don't necessarily expect people to be not using at all, because if you're an opioid addict and we're trying to get you into a Suboxone program, and before you can get into the program, you go into the sober living apartment, they're not going to not be able to use. They're not going to have negative drug tests. That's just not a reality, or even with alcohol, until they've been more settled in their sobriety. So having a positive drug screen is not going to kick somebody out of our sober living apartment. Using in the sober living apartment will, and we've had that where we have found needles, we've found alcohol, and that's why we have to do the sweeps and the searches. But they have to agree not to use in the sober living apartment. So the folks who are struggling with addiction, and they don't have a stable or sober supportive housing. Currently, everyone who is involved in the sober living apartment is court involved. Some are in the Healing to Wellness court, some are in regular court, or some are referred to the court through a child welfare case or a neglect case. The team decides if the person is appropriate, and like I said, we're very low barrier. So if the person is willing to try to get sober, and I don't even say that they want to get sober, they're just willing to try to get sober, and they're willing to agree not to use the sober living apartment, then we let them in and give them a shot, because we have seen people succeed that I would never have expected would succeed. And so I've learned through the last 5 years that you just never know who is going to be the person who succeeds and who is going to fail. Some people have failed in the sense of left the program and took off and chose their drug over coming back, and we haven't seen them since. But we always welcome people back. But people have left the program when I would not have expected them to leave the program, and they've succeeded when I would not have predicted that they would succeed. But now, I know that you can't predict who's going to succeed and who's going to fail, so we don't try to make that evaluation. We're just happy that people show up. For me, if somebody who is an opioid addict is showing up anywhere close to when they're supposed to show up at the beginning, that's awesome. And the fear for us is that they're going to go out and overdose. And so if they're showing up here, then we know where they are. We know, if when young people disappear, I'm always afraid that they're being trafficked somewhere, and I worry about them. And that's what I tell them if we find them again, is that I was worried to death about where they were. So I really want, and my team philosophy and what I try to instill in my team is that if they're showing up, even if they're not coming out with a negative drug test, that's positive. That's what we want. Showing up is the first step and the most important step. And we really give them a lot of praise for just showing up, because that's they got to show up. If they don't show up, then they're not going to heal. And then it says the judge has the final say. So there's a lot of times where the team is like, I don't want to deal with this person, and I'm like, okay, what's the problem? And they'll say, she'll cause a lot of drama or whatever. And it's like, well, okay, drama causing is not it doesn't cause people to not be in our program. It may be more work for you. I'm sorry, but that's what we signed up for. So, and I always tell them, if people weren't relapsing and if people weren't creating drama or committing crimes, then we wouldn't have jobs. And I would like to not have that job, but it's not going to happen. It's employment stability. So as I said, we took our first tenants in April of 2017. And since then, we've had 10 men and 7 women have come through the apartments. We've had folks for less than a week, and sometimes they come in and abscond. And absconding meaning they've taken off. We generally issue warrants, and those are the folks that, as I said, I'm afraid are being trafficked. We just found out one of the young women was posting on Facebook, which makes me, in a positive way. So I feel a little relieved that she hasn't overdosed and is still out there somewhere. But, that we don't know. Sometimes the opioid addicts just go underground and we don't find them for a year or two. So the outcomes vary between women and men. As I said, there's absconding. 2 folks graduated with and got independent housing and are doing really well, and there's 3 current residents. So, I have to say with the women, the women are a lot more difficult to work with. I think that they express their, I call it drama, their conflicts with their roommates, they express them more, and the guys tend to just not interact with each other, or they don't talk to each other. But the women will come to us and say, she's leaving dishes in the sink, and and I'm like, you guys are adults, come on. And that's when they go talk to the substance use counselor and work with each other to try to figure out how to get along better. With the men, we also had 2 folks who have disappeared and have warrants out for them. One left one left before the 6 months were up and relapsed. 3 has left and with independent housing and remained sober. And then unfortunately, we had one opioid overdose for a young man who had been he had just come into the program, and that's really, of course, as you know, when people are most in danger is when they're trying to get off the drug. We were working to get him into a medication-assisted treatment program, and he had been starting withdrawal and then went back and used, and we think he probably got some opioid with fentanyl in it and overdosed in the apartment in January, and that was, of course, really difficult for the program, for the participants, for the staff, and we did a lot of work around that, around the secondary trauma, and of course the family was devastated too, although the family was extremely grateful to the help we were trying to give him and didn't blame our program in any way, but it was extremely difficult. So, and then there's 3 current residents. We've never actually had 4 residents at any one time in either of the apartments, because I think a lot of people say somebody's coming in and then that motivates them to get on out. And I'm happy to take any questions if you guys want to ask anything, but so it's been really helpful, and it's been really key, I think, to folks, especially the folks on opioids and alcohol, to get away from their families, to get some space so that they're, as I said before, to give their brains time to heal. And we know for us, it's at least 3 months before people are starting to really be able to make decisions based on consequences that they've thought through, rather than just acting impulsively. And that's just really when we start seeing people kind of come back into themselves, and that's when people in our program start talking about how they feel better, how they feel like they're thinking more clearly. And that's just really been really amazing. And it's amazing to see, and I know you've all seen that in your programs. And those of you who use MAT, medication-assisted treatment, the folks getting on Suboxone or methadone, it's just amazing to see their anxiety decrease because they don't have to worry about withdrawal, and they can really focus on their sobriety and focus on doing what they need to do to maintain their sobriety. So Pojoaque, has quite a bit, and a lot of this has come in the last 5 years with kind of along with the Healing to Wellness Court. We do have residential treatment options in the area, and we often put people in those at first, and then when they come out, they get into the wellness court, and then they can go into the sober living apartment. I love the people getting onto Suboxone when they need it. I have no issues with that in my court. So folks use Suboxone, they use methadone. We're lucky enough to be close enough to Santa Fe that we do have good resources for folks getting that. And then we use evidence-based substance abuse treatment. The matrix is what we use here for substance abuse groups. And we're lucky enough to have a licensed alcohol and drug abuse counselor on staff here at the courthouse. And having things located right centrally in the court is really important because, as you all know, the transportation is a killer, and people can't get places, then they can't get the help. And that's so true for so many tribal communities and folks in rural areas. So we have worked really hard to we have our treatment provider come to the courthouse to do groups. So they come, and we provide an office for our mental health counselor to come here to the courthouse 2 or 3 days a week to meet with people. So we don't have a mental health counselor on staff, but we provided the space for them to come in and do therapy and hold groups. One of our participants started their own Red Road to Wellbriety group. We just give them the space, and we give them the books and the resources, and if they want training, we help them with training. We're going to send some of our alumni up to get peer support training from the Red Road up in, I think, Colorado Springs. We do a cognitive behavioral therapy group, which is called moral recognition therapy, which is evidence-based. It's not evidence-based with respect to Native American communities yet, as far as I know, but for the general population, it helps people kind of change how they think about relationships and their relationship to criminal activity. And we use that for everyone in our Healing to Wellness court. They have to go through that group. And then we also have a trauma group, and we have healthy relationship groups, and everything is tied to trauma. In this, we always start from the basis of let's deal with trauma. And we just had Ansley came and did a trauma assessment of our courthouse, and we're trying to implement some of the things that the NAICJA recommended that we do, or NAICJA recommended that we do to improve our trauma awareness in our court.
I want to interrupt for a second. I think that trauma awareness for professionals is extremely important for everybody to kind of do a couple times a year, just to kind of remember why we're doing this work.
All right, so we have, and I totally agree with you, Trina, and you, Judge McGinnis, that for folks that are at this place in their lives, we know that it's not just a fun thing they decided to do once and then it got out of control. People who get to this place have experienced a great deal of trauma, and if we don't address those kind of underlying conditions that snowball, then people can't maintain their sobriety. They really do have to work on some of those things. And so it has to be a holistic approach. And I so appreciate both of your comments about that. We're here to the interactive part, but of course we were so interactive through all of Trina's presentation. We've already really talked about what we're doing, what you're all doing in your communities for sober support. So if you would like to just write anything that you didn't share before into the chat, that would be great. And Rita, if you are interested in getting a trauma assessment at your court and you're one of the CTOS grantees, you're totally eligible, just like Pojoaque was. So if you want to just send us an email, we can get that taken care of for you. And it looks like Ansley is writing some stuff in chat now, which likely will be about that. But you are eligible to receive that. So please do think about a trauma assessment.
And Jessica, that trauma assessment is available online. I don't have the address on me, but I will get that to you today or tomorrow.
Okay. That's great. Thank you.
And it's free. You can download it. It's meant for people to use. It's meant for treatment teams and professionals to use. So they could also be 100% when they are serving their clients. Because we all have trauma of some kind. So you have to recognize how your trauma impacts your clients. So they made it available for anybody who wants to use it.
Yeah, secondary trauma is very, very common among professionals. And I mean, I admire all of you so much for working with other people's pain every day. That's a hard lift. Yeah. So that brings me to our kind of last question, which are any barriers that you've encountered in providing and maintaining sober support services for folks in your communities. So if you want to talk about some barriers or maybe some barriers that you overcame, you can do that in the chat now.
One of the barriers we've had here in Pojoaque is the jurisdictional issues, because if a tribal member is caught up in the state system, it's really hard for us to kind of get them out in a sense, even though they've been engaged with our Healing to Wellness Court. If they end up picking up a case in the state, then it's very difficult for us to interact in a way that will, I think, be beneficial to the client, because the state has more of a, put them in jail kind of mentality, or, let them languish in jail way longer than I would ever let anybody stay in jail. We have developed some relationships with some of the judges. So some of the judges are actually sentencing folks in the state to complete the Pojoaque Healing to Wellness Court, which is really great. But, Pojoaque is a pretty small land base of 20 square miles. And so, if you're on one side, 100 yards away, you can be in the state. And, if you're picked up there, then you can be, we can lose our clients to the state system.
Have you, or do you anticipate that being a problem with your sober housing as well, that somebody who's in sober housing could pick up a new charge in the state and you wouldn't be able to do anything with them?
Yeah, and our probation officer has a great relationship with the state probation officer, so, we try to work with the state, as I said, but a lot of times what would be a misdemeanor here on the Pueblo, possession of opioid, is a felony in the state. So, it just creates a barrier to really getting people the help they need, or getting it in a timely manner, because they may take 2 months for them to get to the point where the judge is going to release them in the state.
Yeah, I guess everybody has to be geographically aware at all times.
Right, it is really weird. I mean, sometimes it can be bizarre. And also our jail is rife with illegal drugs, so folks who are in jail are not going to be staying sober. They're going to be using lots of stuff. It's incredible how easy it is for people in jail to get opioids and meth and basically anything they want, benzos.
I've had that same issue working with juveniles. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Like my kids tell me, you were taking a breath so that it's time for me to talk. I've had that same issue with being in a semi-rural area and then being between between the reservations. It's really important for the treatment teams to have a relationship with the tribal courts, and the tribal, Gila River has a juvenile drug court. but to get to know the judges on both sides and to get to know the probation officers, because when you really need to have your child or your client go into a program that you're working with, and then they'll support you. So those relationships are extremely important. I do really quick, too, want to touch on something that the judge mentioned earlier. When her juveniles disappear, she gets worried. And this is a whole other webinar on juvenile trafficking and sex trafficking and sexual exploitation. But we have to remember, too, that a lot of our clients have had sexual exploitations in some manner or another, whether it's male or female. And so when we're looking at services for them and community supports, we also really need to take that into account and not re-traumatize them.
Right. I think it goes back to a little bit of that safety stuff that we were talking about earlier as well, that that we really need to make sure that the re-traumatization is something that we think about as part of a safety plan for people. So it's not just, will they, go to a meeting where they might get harassed, but is this meeting, are they going to feel okay at this meeting? Or is it something that might be triggering because, maybe it's a woman at a meeting with a lot of men, and that's going to be something that she's not going to be comfortable with, right? So I think it's so important to really keep all of those things in mind.
Yes, it is. It's very important.
We do have a couple of barriers that were identified here in the chat, Nathaniel, with the financial barriers, which I think is just always something that is in the background, that everybody's always trying to be creative, thinking about how to do more with less. It does sound like when we talked earlier about some of the online services, that might be a cure for both some financial barriers, and Sabrina, you noted lack of transportation. And so if we can be thinking about some of those things, maybe participating in virtual groups might be a way for folks to access some of those resources that they don't have to go anywhere for. Of course, that does presume that folks have internet, but we're getting closer to everyone having some internet, so that's hopefully going to be reduced as a barrier. Trina, are there any barriers that you've encountered besides working with the state folks?
Villages that are, sorry about that, my microphone was off. I think having access to social media and internet can be a barrier for rural areas where they just don't have the technology to, to get internet, or they don't have the service cell towers. You're in the mountains, and you just can't get that. Transportation is always a barrier. But also I think, too, getting families to understand and not blame and judge can be a barrier, and that takes a lot of education and a lot of patience to really work with families. If somebody relapses, I think the judge was talking earlier about, they're showing up to court. For our team, it was, hey, they've been smoking for 4 years as a juvenile. They started at the age of 12. They're 16, 17 now, and we just want them to stop. That's unrealistic. We show lower levels. So getting families to understand that and getting family support sometimes is a barrier. And so, the more we continue to educate them and help them understand the recovery process, will eliminate that barrier over time.
All right, and I'll turn it back to the participants. Are there any final questions before we wrap up today? Oh, see, Rita, engaging families. Yeah, I think families are sometimes the problem, and sometimes they don't want to interact anymore with their family members who have been drug users if they're not kind of active in use themselves. So you have both sides of a challenge with families.
And I do think that's where the patience comes in, where you have to re-engage, and you have to engage and engage, and you just keep going back, and you keep going back. I've had families tell me, do you ever go away? Do you ever stop coming over? And I'm like, not yet. You know, we're gonna do this. We're doing this together. And the commitment they see, along with having really good boundaries with as a treatment provider and as treatment teams, you want to have good boundaries. We all have families where we think, oh, maybe I set that boundary, I overstepped that boundary a little bit. But you want to keep your boundaries, and then your clients then know, okay, this is what this person can do for me. And we all go above and beyond our jobs at times. Everybody has did that. But remembering that you just keep going back and you have patience and consistency. And that really helps with family engagement. But it is a process, especially when families are used to people giving up on them.
Absolutely.
Right, and there are still some good resources showing up in the chat. Just again, I want to remind everybody that this has been recorded, and these resources will all be available as part of the transcript. Ansley, I'm going to turn it back over to you to wrap up. I think we have a couple of slides. I'll put the first one up.
Thanks, Jessica, and thank you, Trina and Judge McGinnis, for that very interesting and informative presentation. So before we conclude, I just wanted to take a moment to talk about NAICJA and our work in tribal communities. As some of you already know, NAICJA is a tribal justice professional organization whose goal is to build tribal court capacity. We do a pretty broad range of work for tribal communities, including training and technical assistance to support tribal courts. And like it was mentioned earlier, this includes trauma-informed court systems trainings and trauma assessments. We're also TA providers for the Bureau of Justice Assistance CTAF Purpose Area 3 grantees. So part of our support for tribal courts is our annual conference that's coming up on October 16th through 19th in Albuquerque. This year will feature topics that highlight ways in which tribes utilize their courts to strengthen, restore, and protect their communities. And we'll continue to offer cutting-edge training for judges and court clerks. Again, those dates are October 16th through 19th if you're interested in attending, and that's in Albuquerque at Isla Pueblo. Another part of our work is the Tribal Access to Justice Innovation website. This website allows us to highlight and share different programs in tribal communities. So a lot of different programs were brought up today. So if you know of a promising program, let us know about it. And if it's not already highlighted on our website, we can go ahead and share it. That website is tribaljustice.org. And again, our goal with it is to learn about emerging practices and share that information as many tribes are addressing common challenges. And that concludes our webinar. My email address is ansley@naija.org if anyone has any questions or training and technical assistance requests. Otherwise, thank you to our presenters for your presentation and to NCJ, FCJ for hosting, and thank you everyone for joining.